Welcome to the Energizing America Podcast, where we talk all things energy, why we need in our business, communities, and life. Excited to sit down today and switch things up a little bit. We've had Shar and our team for going on 3 years. We've been pretty active in the environmental arena of the oil and gas industry, and as we continue to expand that, now is the time to finally get the world to meet Shar. So welcome, Shar.
Thank you.
About time you get brave enough to come on here. Excited to sit down with Erin. How's that, Erin? And she's our new, what did we title you?
I'm the air permitting specialist.
So we have a new air permitting specialist, so we'll get into that as well. So, as we know in our life, especially because we were just in Oklahoma City, Shar, we had a great trip there, didn't we?
Yeah, it was lovely.
We met 3 different clients. We went into Oklahoma City where we met with a couple. We drove over to Tulsa, had a really awesome meeting over there.
Mm-hmm.
And
good pizza.
Great pizza, yeah. Well, we had too much pizza, but that was all right. That's the way it is when you do client interaction. Sometimes we don't know.
Everybody in the company got some. So that it turned out for the best.
It does turn out for the best. And Erin, you'll find this out because you come from a regulatory side. A lot of what we do, we're not exactly sure what we're doing when it comes to client interaction because, frankly, the best thing we can do is provide service. So when it comes to like this whining and dining a client, we really are terrible at it. But anyways, we gave it our best. We had a lot of pizza. We had maybe 40 pizzas for the 6 of us.
Yeah.
And then we invited the accounting staff down and so on, and we got the pizza 8, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless, it was really cool being in Oklahoma City and Tulsa because I don't get to see this side of our business as deeply as I would prefer, just due to lack of time. And to sit down with the professionals, it was specific to environmental is why we were in those 2 areas. And it was just really awesome to not just get to meet those clients better, but to hear you and Ashley and see your passion and the discussion about the role of environmental and oil and gas. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we can overstate what that role has become.
Right.
It's huge.
Yeah.
So you guys talked a little bit about when we were in specific Oklahoma City, a lot about the air quality regulations. What have you seen even just in our 3 years of relationship together, but even prior, what are you seeing in the oil industry when it comes to air quality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely feel like I was just like looking back to when we started, especially down in the Permian and where we were at with our clients. And that was right when air quality was becoming more of a hot topic for our clients and seeing how it's grown from just doing LDAR, which would be like in our arena, audiovisual olfactory inspections and OGIs, which is optical gas imaging. And sorry, for those of you who don't know, the LDAR is leak detection and repair. So for our clients, it's become the inspections and the regulations haven't necessarily changed yet so much in what we're trying to figure out, but the regulatory agencies have come down a lot harder on the oil and gas industry, from what I can tell. And it's really kind of interesting just being present for that and watching all of our clients bolster their air quality programs and making sure that not only are they following regulations, but they're trying to make a difference in their emissions. And I don't know, I don't know if that really answers the question so much, but I feel like this isn't something that's going away. We're definitely going to see this grow bigger. And I feel like Erin can kind of speak more to that from a regulatory standpoint. But as far as our clients, like they're just getting more and more, I don't want to say constricted, but they're having to adhere more and more to regulations so that they can make that promise to the public that we're actually making a difference to what we're putting into the air and what the people around us are breathing in.
That's, I think, what I've noticed, Shar, with our clients specifically in the last several years is, maybe the regulation hasn't necessarily changed. There's been some change.
For sure.
We're continuing to see a lot of rules that are out there that potentially could continue to change the way we operate. But what I'm seeing is not just a requirement on our producers, but a willingness from our producers, right? The producers have started to understand better that if we want to continue to do this, and by the way, America needs us to continue to do this, right? We need this energy. And as we get better about recognizing that we have this need, and at the same time the public expects us to do things better, let's just embrace it. And the clients that we met with specifically a couple of weeks ago, they've turned from a complaint like, oh, I have to do this because the government said to, we want to do this, right? And I think that's going to play out pretty well for the producers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if they do a better job of being on the forefront of it, how can we do a better job of keeping our flaring down? How can we do a better job of inspecting our equipment for failures before there's a leak? All of that stuff will bode well for them because the regulators will have less incentive to go after them. So just, if industry doesn't make the rules, somebody's going to.
Right.
And so as an industry, it's pretty cool that we're willing to start making our rules for ourselves, essentially.
And I was actually, that brings up a kind of an idea that I saw somewhere the stat the other day that since the 1970s, I think it is, since EPA was instated, air emissions for hazardous air pollutants has come down 78%. And so there's still kind of a chunk that needs to be taken care of. But one, we've made a lot of progress. And then the mindset within our clients, or I don't know if that's fair to say, within industry, just in general, has changed and shifted towards not only does this actually impact people around us, but we were at a different client of ours yesterday, but they had it was amazing the amount of cleanliness that was there and the things they had put in place to make sure that there was no loss of product. So when we're talking emissions, there's actually a loss of product for the client for natural gas or methane or whatever it is. And so when they recapture those emissions, it ends up being a benefit for them in the long term. And it was pretty cool to see how it can be done. And this facility was maybe created 20 years ago, but it was just kind of just an illustration of how it can be done and how we can continue to just make kind of what is the confluence of regulation and production
where both parties can win.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what's cool about that. There's so many extremes on both ends, and no doubt, Erin, you've seen this on the regulatory side. There's the extreme environmental groups on one end, and there's the extreme industry pros on the other end. And then there's in between there, 99% of the people, like Wescom and the producers we're working for, whether we're talking about the coal folks we work for, the iron ore folks, the oil and gas, we're all somewhere right here in the middle where we're just trying to get product out that folks need in the best way possible. Yeah. And I think that gets lost sometimes because it's not a good headline, right? It's not a good headline to say that insert company name followed and met all regulatory requirements. It's not really fun to insert a stat and say that 78% or we've come down from air pollutants by 78% in a matter of 30 years, right? You have to go dig for that stat because we just hear the extremes on either side. And clearly, I guess maybe you need some of those extremes to help make some progress, but boy, they tend to overtake the conversation. So coming from the regulatory side, you were in Wyoming.
Yes.
And what was your role in Wyoming?
Yeah, so I worked for the state of Wyoming, Division of Environmental Quality, and I was in the air quality division. Okay. So my focus was ambient air monitoring. And unique to Wyoming, I got to interface with a lot of industry because Wyoming's air permit conditions a lot of times contained monitoring conditions. So they were actually having on-site ambient monitoring at their ambient boundaries, essentially where their industry meets the public land. So lots of communication with them about exceedances and what they would do and all the steps they would take to try to prevent these things from happening. And I really did find it to be the state of Wyoming and its industry. It was a partnership. The state of Wyoming understood that minerals, there was mining, oil and gas, manufacturing, vital for the economy. It was a huge job creator, and we wanted them there. But we wanted them to make sure, as the state, we wanted to make sure that they were doing things safely. And they also, as industry, understood that if they follow these permits and work with their engineers and us at the state level, they would be able to continue to operate.
And did they were happy to do that.
Yes,
Is
I
that
thought
your
that there
experience?
was a good back and forth, a collaboration, a camaraderie, a common goal, essentially. The EPA is kind of the higher level, but we've had to kind of be in the middle of the state and kind of be that direct pathway to industry and work together to, bring permits to the state after they've been created, and just say, hey, the state level, we can handle this. We can work with our industry facilities and keep them in compliance and make sure these permits are keeping everyone safe and the environment healthy.
Right. What was the one thing that when industry would have their exceedances, because they happen, I know I worked in a sewer district here in town, and we would sometimes have more mercury than what was allowed, right? We'd have to file for variance for that particular exceedance. In your experience, what was the reason for the exceedance, generally speaking?
So I'd say, interestingly enough, it was oftentimes environmental. So let's take a mine, for example, and just the topography and the environmental makeup of Wyoming, for example. It's very windy and very flat. So the mine, if they'd have an exceedance, it was oftentimes a large stockpile of whatever material they were mining for, and it would high winds would come and they would blow the dust. And then there'd be a PM10 or a PM2.5, just those very small particulates, would be picked up by the monitors, and that would be an exceedance of the national ambient air quality standards. This would happen, but oftentimes they knew this would happen, so they put steps in place to try to prevent them from happening. Watering roads, keeping stockpiles to a certain amount. They were very communicative with the state at that point if there was an exceedance, and also really adhered to these mitigation plans to prevent these from happening, because they knew it could happen and it was out of their control.
Yeah.
So they want to prevent these things.
Well, and I think that's a piece that I've learned in the oil and gas specific industry with the clients I'm more accustomed to working with. It's they want to do the right thing. And so when there's been something bad that's happened, it wasn't because they're trying to be profit hungry, environmental smashing individuals. It was because something happened that they hadn't properly planned for. Think about down in New Mexico, how many days have we been shut down this year for wind? It's been horrible. And in North Dakota, we've had places buried under snow this year that we've never seen buried. Well, our equipment may not be able to withstand that. We don't know until things, oftentimes it's passed and you're like, oh, maybe that's why that leak sprung and now we have a cleanup to do. What we find when we go meet with our clients, let's use the event of a leak. When we're doing a spill remediation, the client oftentimes is driving for a really, really, really good cleanup because they'd rather not have this happen again. And they know full well that it's not a good mark on their record. And they just ultimately want to move product and they want to do it well.
Yeah.
So Shar, you bring Erin in. You're excited to have an air quality specific person on our team.
Yeah.
What are you hoping to learn from Erin?
I feel like I've already learned a lot. And I think that it's, I just am kind of thinking about just in general. I'm so excited to learn more about the permitting process for our clients, and I don't feel like I have a good understanding of that. And she's dug into it already and kind of showed me a lot of things about how it's going to impact our clients down in Oklahoma and in New Mexico and the Permian Basin down there, which is also Texas a little, but also up here in the Twin Ports and how that, what did we look up? And there's just, Minnesota specifically has just this wide range of tiers.
Yeah, permit types
that were
with your emission levels.
Yeah, that like any of our clients, it doesn't matter what they're producing or what they're doing on their site. It all comes down to what their emissions are, specifically of hazardous air pollutants. And I just think of I don't know, anytime we're dealing with something up here, it can be applied to, and I say up here because we don't have oil wells up here. And that is primarily what we're dealing with down south. Anything that we deal with up here can be applied to the oil wells down south. And anything that we're dealing with down south can be applied to what we're dealing with up here. And our industry up here would be like grains and cement and mining and that kind of stuff. And it's really cool to zoom out and look at how similar everything actually is.
Do you think most people understand that, Shar, that when we're pushing more air quality regulation, you just hear it out in the community, and I don't care where you're talking, especially when the Bakken boomed in North Dakota. You heard a lot about natural gas flaring, and people would panic about flaring, and you got to have better regulation and all this stuff. Are people associating that when we're talking like flaring or we're talking emissions, we're talking general, like if we're going to hold the oil and gas industries accountable, we have to hold all industries accountable, right? And so I think when we started talking more and more about air quality, it was like a light bulb went on in my head that, wait a second, this air quality is not specific to oil and gas. Air quality is anywhere where you have emissions happening that otherwise shouldn't be happening, or that are outside of normal environmental conditions, right? And you think about up here in the Twin Ports, we have all kinds of industries that are doing various activities that could potentially be, quote unquote, polluting the air. Those activities may or may not need permitting to ensure that they're following the regulation. You know, you say you want to learn more about the permitting side, and it's funny to me because we do so much spill remediation where you're working very closely with state agencies to close out spills and the potential for, future activities to occur on those locations. What are you thinking is going to be so much different on the permitting side? Is it because you're requesting versus trying to fix something that shouldn't have happened?
Yeah, so for the most part, everyone has to get, and I'll come kind of circle back to that. Everyone has to get the approval from the state, and this is in layman's terms, like approval from the state and or feds to run their facility. And so they have to say, we have X amount of emissions, whatever those emissions are. And when we're dealing with permitting, what that ends up being, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong at any point, but you're saying so the state says this is what you're allowed to emit, and as a client and or consultant, you're saying, okay, this is what we're allowed to emit, and whether we need to have caps in place or engineering controls in place to make sure that we don't emit above that. That's one way that we get to help the client keep track of that and make sure that they're not emitting more than that they say they would, so that they're staying within what the state says you can emit. And then also, if they don't have those controls in place, helping them, and actually both if they do and they don't, but helping them continue to produce and make money, which is kind of a lot of times what they're there for, help keep America going and stay within those regulations so that they don't have to deal with this and have conflict with the state or other regulatory agencies. There's so much that goes into it, and there's a reason that permits are there. And it's just really cool to get to be a part of helping our clients continue to send out cement or send out iron ore so that they don't have to shut everything down and make everything continue to be chaos,
So on the permitting side, you get to have a role in developing program, asking or figuring out how much emissions are allowed or are going to be emitted, getting the approval for such, and then also monitoring that the activities are ensuring that production can keep on going. Yes. Whereas oftentimes when we're talking on the spill remediation, which we have more experience with the state agencies on the spill remediation, we're dealing with trying to recover from an event that happened. Yes. It seems to me on the air quality side, we get to participate in the events not happening.
Yeah.
True enough.
Proactive versus reactive nature of the spill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What do you think about the EPA's role in industry, Erin?
EPA's role in industry?
Is it something that is getting further, or are we where we need to be?
It's an interesting question because I dealt a lot with EPA, but I was more at the state level and seeing more, at an industry facility. I would say the EPA's goal is to, maintain health of the environment and human health. I don't always see them as maybe leading industry in the direction of how to get there. So the rules are being put in place, and it's kind of like, it's up to industry to fill in the gaps. So that's kind of, I don't see them as, positive or negative, but it's more like authority, not a lot of collaboration. And I feel like that's where the state and then consultants come in, kind of fill in the gaps between the higher regulatory body and the industry and get them there.
And do you feel like consultants play a pretty vital role in that with the industry?
I do. I think it's huge. My experience in Wyoming is every industrial facility that had a permit in the state had consultants running their environmental programs because they were very complex and, could be a headache at times. And that was why I was very excited to come on in this role. I saw how quickly they could move, make decisions. They were enthusiastic about their work. They were happy to, find what the client needed and just remediate and get them there where they needed to go.
And you didn't run into consultants who were trying to do it halfway. They're just trying to ensure that their client can meet what the state requires.
Exactly.
And oftentimes what we've also noticed with our clients is when they do that, back to Shar's, one of her points was, there's actually product that's getting wasted when you're having an issue on the environmental side, whether it's natural gas flaring or whatever the deal is. That's a real product that you can turn into market. And believe me, industry, yes, they exist to make a profit, and they will do that. And so as a consultant, you get this unique opportunity to move the conversation from a cost deal to a profit conversation. And evidence of that is one client we met with last week, Shar, or a couple weeks ago. He said, I know when we have a spill and I send the bill through, I'm going to hear from the engineer upstairs. This specific engineer is always going to call me and he's going to say, what is going on? But he said, I've worked with him long enough now that he just trusts it. He knows that it's the right thing to do and it turns into it better for us. So I think we're starting to see more and more of that happen with consultants who can play a really good role in that. When you think forward on industry and air quality, are you concerned about how are we keeping up on the ever-changing regulation? Because it never stops, even at the state level. What are some of the methods you do to keep ahead of what the regulation actually is?
Yeah, I guess just kind of trying to keep on top of what's emerging, the news, and then just doing the work to kind of do those readings. Oftentimes, the governing body, EPA, who puts out a new rule will, put out the rule and oftentimes do like a factual breakdown. So you can kind of, read it in layman's terms and then also look at it in the federal regulation and then just see how it would apply to any industries that we work with. Can't speak to any right off the top of my head.
Right. Are there specific publications or associations that you're part of that help you keep track of this?
I think LinkedIn is really great because I follow a lot of other environmental consulting groups and networks, and that is one of the top, stories or posts I see are new rules coming out this year. Every time there's a discussion of changing one of the national ambient air quality standards, there's lots of communication about it.
And we do find that it takes a while for regulation to switch, right?
Yes.
Like there's a lot of conversation about it, but for the rule to actually come in place, like in New Mexico, boy, they've been talking about some significant rule changes for quite some time. Mm-hmm. And then comment period happens, it gets kicked out, more comments come, it gets kicked out again. But speaking of New Mexico, what you have attended like a 4C conference before. Mm-hmm. Has that been helpful?
Yeah, I felt like that was really helpful. In fact, Erin and I were just discussing that. We went through a bunch of different types of conferences that would be helpful for, just making sure we're on top of everything with our clients, anything that relates to our clients. And that was one thing that she even came back and said, like, I think that this is going to be the one that is really can be helpful. And the thing about the 4C conference, and like doing a little plug here, y'all, they invite in so many different types of consultants as well as suppliers for like with LDAR drones and FLIR drones that like check the emissions in here. And then FLIR type of cameras, any supply or tool that might help us and our clients quantify or check their emissions. So it's really like an air quality program conference. And it was really, really helpful. Like even this, subpart K was kind of a big topic last year, and like what that entailed for our clients. And it was really helpful place to learn how that was going to impact anybody that we deal with.
I think that's important that we never forget that. As consultants, we owe it to our clients that we're constantly keeping up on those ever-changing rules and regulations, because frankly, anyone can go out and do a AVO. And I'm saying that very loosely, right? And anyone can develop a little program to make sure they're doing their AVO. Mm-hmm. The challenge that industry is faced with is how do we keep up with the changing requirements of that? And that's really where we find ourselves doing a lot of reading, a lot of conference attending, lots of collaboration, lots of discussion. So I hope we can keep that up. Tell me, folks will say, what in the world? You're an oil and gas service provider and you have an environmental team. What are you thinking and what are you doing? And it's always surprising to me how little people really know about the role of environmental in the oil field. Yeah. Like, do you understand how much the oil and gas producers do to ensure that they're doing it responsibly? One of the things that we do is an LDAR program, leak detection and repair program, and that has several elements that you've already referenced, OGI inspections. We do AVO inspections. What is the goal of these inspections?
Not make the air gross.
And when we're doing, like, what is an AVO that because I mean, honestly, we have two folks who are embedded techs at one of the producers, and they're basically running an AVO program for them. And then we have a couple other techs that work for a couple of our different producers that are out doing AVOs. Some of them they have to do weekly, some of them they have to do monthly. What is an AVO and what's it? Why are we doing it?
An AVO stands for, I think I said, audio, visual, olfactory. So eyes, ears, nose. So it's checking to make sure that there's nothing that we can sense is leaking with three of those senses. And obviously, I mean, if there's any other sense, like you're getting blown into, but you can't see it, think of that as well. But using those senses to check and make sure that as you're walking through a site, and they do AVOs in other arenas and other industries, but this is something we're talking specific to oil and gas because that's where we do it right now. So we're going through the site to make sure that there's nothing leaking. And the reason that matters is so often there's people that are on oil sites or well sites, batteries, if you will. If you don't check and make sure that there is nothing leaking, it can lead to something more. And it sounds kind of silly to just walk through a site and check with your eyes, ears, and nose to make sure that nothing is leaking. But if there is a small leak and then you check that, you note that, and then you come back and it still is leaking, and the next week it's probably leaking more, or over time things corrode, and oil and produced water can be kind of hard on infrastructure. So you have to just make sure that it's not leaking that way. And it's just making sure that there's nothing bigger going to happen down the pipeline. We see that even sometimes air. I've always had a little bit of a hard time with air, and I don't know if other people feel this way, but air is like, you can't really see it. And so it's hard to quantify in my mind, even if like you take a sample and you're like, okay, this is how much benzene is in the air. You can't see it, so it's a little bit hard to say it's there. But we do know that different things impact human health and the environment, specifically benzene is directly related to cancer, not just in California. And then when those things get worse, then you have like an oil spill, which can be seen. And everybody is like, what is happening? There's this oil leak that's coming out of the pipe on this battery. Well, it could have originated as just a gas leak, just like a little leak of gas that you didn't
eventually ate
catch.
at something that caused a failure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the same is true with OGI. OGI is more there to make sure that their emissions, that the producer's emissions are low. And as EPA, because EPA does flyovers in the Permian and especially in oil fields, and their cameras can quantify the amount of emissions that are happening. They can also see smog and air quality. So what that refers to is like if people are breathing it in, it can have a negative impact to their health over time. And when we're talking OGIs and that type of, there's also the CAMs. What does that stand for? This,
I'm not sure.
It's when there's
Continuous air monitoring?
Continuous air monitoring.
Just hoping that was it.
That is to make sure that there's the air quality in the area continues to either go down or remain from that facility lower than is going to impact the area in general.
So it turns out that we actually have clients that are spending money to get ahead of a potential equipment failure in the sense of doing weekly AVOs, monthly AVOs, OGI inspections, even though the EPA and or state regulatory agency is doing their own inspections.
Yes, and I should make sure that it's clear that AVO inspections are on the air quality side of things. That is how it can be applied to the individual producer. But it also can impact the air quality and the OGIs. When they're not doing OGIs, that's when, because OGIs are expensive and they're not as easy for a producer to do all of the time. So it's having the AVOs there on the weekly and monthly basis, depending on production, is really going to help lower the amount of emissions from that facility, as well as making sure that we don't have a leak in the future.
Okay, so then OGIs, what drives people doing an OGI over an AVO?
Because you can actually, so OGI is an infrared camera and you can see gas moving, right?
It was actually fascinating. Shar was out at one of our locations. I say one of my locations.
Yeah.
Because we don't actually produce oil and gas, despite everyone's thinking about it. And the gentleman, okay, let me, you take the camera. And I'd seen it, and he says, no, point at that valve over there.
Mm-hmm.
And the valve was leaking gas, and it was very obvious in the OGI camera. Not at all obvious when you looked at this particular valve. So I think OGI has a pretty cool role in that it can show the missing things that you can't see with your audio visual olfactory, but you can't see that leaking gas. Do you suppose that technology is going to advance this idea of AVO and OGI even further? And if so, what are your thoughts about that? Are you excited? Or are you worried as consultants that your job might go away?
I just see it as more tools to do our job better, more effectively. And I think it's great to see, I guess the market is moving, the technology along. So there's need for this, there's higher regulation, and, they're creating opportunity for these, technologies to be more readily available, maybe more affordable, and more widely used. I think it's ultimately a positive for, across the board.
Yeah, well, we've seen technology really impact our ability to do things well. And so if we truly care about the environment, let's do it well. Let's use technology, right? Erin, when you came on board with Wescom, you probably told a couple of people that you were going to work for Wescom, and they said, what in the world, who the heck is Wescom? And so you had to come up with an explanation of who Wescom is. And did you get any weird vibes that you're going to work for an oil and gas service provider, which accounts for probably, if we're honest, 70% of our total volume of work that we do? Is that weird to you to think of environmental consulting within an oil and gas service industry?
Well, I will say when I told people in my life, a lot of them, knew what work I was doing or were working with me in some capacity in regulatory, regulatory level. And it's not abnormal at all. Environmental professionals can be at the industry level, at the regulatory level, and then consultants as well. It's very common. I think ultimately we just want to help our clients meet their environmental goals. And I think Wescom is unique. I can see, kind of researching the company, just seeing the diversification and just the routes that Wescom has taken over the years to get to where it is today. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Identified an opportunity in a field you were, working in as a electrical automation, et cetera, and just realized that environmental can be another just avenue to go down. So no, definitely didn't get any pushback. If anything, everyone's thinking it's a really interesting opportunity because I think environmental consultants are just very curious people who like working in this industry, like seeing new avenues to use their skills. So.
The reason why I asked that is because actually, Shar, when we were in Oklahoma City, one of our clients, she said that she goes to Chicago sometimes, right? And she'll be at an eatery and meeting some friends and some peers, and they'll be like, "Oh, what do you do for work?" And she'll be like, "Oh, I'm an environmentalist." And they're like, "Oh, that's so cool," And she said, "I never tell them I'm an environmentalist for an oil and gas producer because it feels like that's wrong."
Yeah.
Have you had that push?
Yeah, well, I mean, definitely it was actually the other way around when I was in the Pacific Northwest and I said I was just the community that I was in. I told people I was an environmental consultant and they were like, oh, and like lots of judgment.
Because when people hear that, they think of somebody chaining themselves to a front door of a bank that just gave money to a pipeline company. I in my head, that's what I think of when I hear the word environmentalist.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely. And then down in, I was actually talking with a client down in New Mexico about that, and just like depending on who you're talking to, the different perspectives. Yeah. And down in the oil field, being an environmental consultant, not really a cool thing to be. So you'd go on a site and you're just like, I'm just here to check, whatever it is. And I will say there's been a shift. Like it's not as much of a taboo conversation as it used to be. I feel like there used to be a little bit more of a division between especially talking about oil and gas and environmental. I feel like there's been an embracing of the environmental side of things from oil and gas. And I've seen that like at NMOGA and 4C and different conferences that we've went to. It really starts to be clear that we're kind of all on the same team and just trying to make sure that we're speaking the same language.
But you say we're kind of, so do you feel like we still have work to go in the oil and gas industry specific to understand that like the role of an environmental consultant and the role of us being on location is actually to ensure that you have a job tomorrow?
Yeah. I really feel, and I feel like there's a lot of ways to go, or there's a long ways to go in that regard. And that was something that was brought up over and over in the MOGA is how we present ourselves as an industry. And that can be said also for oil and gas, mining, like any sort of industry that has historically, or right now there's a lot of pushback from higher up in politics of like saying that we shouldn't be doing this in the United States. Well, turns out if we want to do it in the United States, we just have to do it well, and we have to take care of the land that we have. And I'm not saying we're doing a terrible job because, I mean, we went down 78% in air pollutants, and that's just talking about air pollutants. And that's talking about the United States as a whole, right? That's not talking about individual industries and individual pockets that have went down probably more significantly than that. And obviously there's been some up and down, but yeah, I think that the way that we present ourselves is going to be imperative to how the industries go here in the US. Like, I don't think that we will be able to be separate. We have to all think the same. And like I said, no, we don't have to all think the same. That's not what I meant, but, we have to speak the same language, like I said, because we do all think similarly, We're just not speaking the same language.
Right. We each have a role
Yeah.
in ensuring the product gets out that, by the way, we all like to use.
Right.
Right. So I think that's what sometimes can get forgotten about is like, oh, she's an environmental consultant, run. No, actually, she drove her car here when she needed the very oil you're producing.
Yes.
So we don't need to run. We just need to make sure that we're meeting the goals that we set out to meet. How do you feel, Erin? Do you feel like we still have room to go as a society to embrace the role of environmental in industry, or what's been your experience?
Yeah, I definitely think there's room to improve. Just that perception. And I really like the term we've been using, speaking the same language, because the end goal ultimately is the same. We want industry to be done well, safely, and continue to provide us the goods and services that we need, provide jobs, help economies. So yeah, I think as long as we can get on more of the same page and just have equal respect for everyone who's on the site or at an industry.
Well, speaking a couple weeks ago with one of our team members, she told me something like this. She said, Shane, it was weird. It was about a particular situation we were trying to get a resolution to. And she said, the difference between you and the other person was when you called me, you asked, how can I help you get this done? Whereas everyone else was asking me, when can you get it done? So I think sometimes with environmental consulting and then with industry, we have to approach it with that mindset. Like, I understand you want to produce X. I'm here to help you produce X. Rather than I'm here to make sure that you're following regulation. And vice versa. From industry, I'm here to make sure that you don't catch me doing something. It's no, how can you help me make sure that I'm meeting these requirements? And I think once we realize that we're all here for the same thing, on both sides of the aisle, for or against additional regulation, you can understand that, hey, we both have a job to do, but so often our extremes can kind of take over and cause us problems. Did you have any negative connotation from when you were working at the state level and you'd have to call industry or reach out to somebody, was it just automatic like, Erin's calling, or how do people respond to state reaching out?
Sure. Well, I do think maybe it was unique, but I think Wyoming and their industry had pretty good relations. But obviously there was still a power dynamic there with the regulators, and typically when we would reach out, it wouldn't always be a congratulatory call. It was typically to let them know that they had, something was off or they had their exceedance. We needed more information about how to get them on the right track. So, I think, it was there and it was always very courteous, but I think there's definitely kind of maybe lingering feelings or just ultimately an underlying power imbalance that I think doesn't need to be there, because as long as we realize we're working towards the same goals, as industries, if they're doing their part, and the state should also, or state or whoever's regulating, should, kind of respect that and be a collaborative member of the partnership.
It can make environmental consulting difficult, right? Nobody wants to spend money that they don't see an immediate benefit from. Mm-hmm. And so I would imagine, and Shar, we deal with that, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah. I feel like our counterparts and the producers deal with it more than we do.
Right, but we feel that,
yes.
Right? Like when we're going to do a spill cleanup, we can feel this hidden pressure of like trying to do it magically for free. And it just doesn't happen, right? And they don't want us to do that. They understand there's a cost to it.
Yeah.
But it's a hidden pressure driven from themselves. Like they know that their phone might ring from the upstairs engineer asking why it costs so much. Right? And I think that's probably why when the regulator reaches out to the industry, they're like, this just automatically means more money. And it's hard to think of, no, this means that we have an opportunity to connect and do better. Yeah. So when you think long-term and overall, is environmental presence in the oil and gas and overall industry going to even get harder for industry to embrace and keep track of?
That's a tough question for me, only because I feel like it's pretty hard sometimes right now, especially when you look at how things are going, especially with air quality and some of the things that have been coming through the pipeline with New Mexico, and they have some timelines that are pretty strict. And as we see our clients trying to adhere to those timelines and do things like continuous air monitoring, the cost to the producer is starting to become burdensome. And I feel like I don't know. I can't really speak for any side as far as like the regulatory side either, or even being a producer, but just from my standpoint, it just seems like time will allow things to become cheaper. If we think of the computer, like it started out enormous and difficult to use, and now we're using them on our phones and even smaller than that, right? So over time, I think that it will be pretty easy for us to quantify and to really diminish the amount of emissions and spills and whatnot that we're putting into the environment. But I feel like initially, like as we continue down this pathway of trying to really reduce the amount of impact that industry has to human health and the environment, and by reduce I mean like make it be null, there is going to be a lot of pain to the producers and to whoever it is that's creating stuff that we have to have in order to maintain the lifestyles that we want.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you have a lot of hope in the long term, but the short term is going to be painful.
Yeah.
But you think we can figure it out?
Yeah, I think that it will be figured out. I mean, like things have a way of balancing themselves out, whether or not.
Yeah, they really do. How do you feel about it, Erin?
I'm hopeful, and I'm actually pretty optimistic, just because I don't see it's not going to go away. It's the reality we live in. The regulations are what they are, and they will continue to maybe even be made more. So I think as long as we see that the work being done in industry is necessary and good for economy and other things, they will meet the regulatory goals, even if it is costly. Because I think ultimately I don't think it's meant to diminish output or, certain industries. I think it's just guidelines to do it as safe as possible for human health and the environment.
So, I want to, before we end this, I want to get one thing, from the regulatory side, what in those conversations you've had on the regulatory side and working, and obviously Wyoming, by the way, it's just one of the coolest states ever. Like, we already know that. We have some friends in Wyoming. I did a podcast with Riley Sassy one time with the Red River. The whole town is just, and by the way, we take their coal all the way over here to Duluth, Minnesota, put it on a ship and ship it over to Detroit, and who knows where it all goes from there. So we love Wyoming. So I think their way of doing business may be different than New Mexico, which we also love, yes. But we acknowledge there's very different set of standards between Wyoming and New Mexico.
Yes.
But did you ever find yourself in conversation like, guess what, folks? This production is going to happen somewhere in the world. And what better spot than right here in America where we can actually control the outcome of said production? Like we do it better, safer, cleaner than anyone. And I think so oftentimes, I wonder oftentimes at the state level if they're thinking about that their goals of decreasing emissions and doing a better job are overtaking their ability to see that we're already doing it way better than everyone else. And if we're not careful, we could put ourselves out of business doing it at all. And then it comes over from overseas where they don't even give it the time of day.
Yeah.
Did you ever hear those conversations at the state level?
Yeah, I think that sentiment was pretty prevalent at the state level, especially since these industries were making up a great deal of the economy. I think mining was the number one output of the state. So that was very well understood and very well, I should also say, like in the state legislation. Oil and gas mining, the producers were very much part of the conversation. And I think at the state level too, where I worked in the environmental, when you work in this industry, you get a different perception of industry than the public has. You work with the individuals, you see how robust their environmental teams can be, their engineering controls, and how well they do want to do in order to keep in business. And you understand that they're taking it seriously. And like you were saying, if it's done here, it can be done well. We have the money, the resources, the controls to do it cleanly and follow regulation. And if it's done in other parts of the world, those might not be the case, and ultimately the output could be a lot greater and have a lot more negative impact on human health and the environment.
Right. We like to think that if it's done overseas, it doesn't impact our environment, but it does. I mean, believe it or not, the air moves, right? And so we're impacted by that. And I think that if we could do a better job as industry marrying that conversation, then we all make better progress. That this isn't, no one's against each other. We're all for the same exact thing. And like I had a conversation one time with a gal who her job was to be a professional protester against pipelines. And we were working at the school together on a project, and it was just her and I and a couple boys there. And I asked her what she does, and she says, well, I'm a professional protester. And then she asks what I do, and I'm in oil and gas, right? Like this was going to be a very fun conversation. But I just started with a very basic premise, like, are you ready to give up the products that you've come to rely on? Like, oil and gas is everywhere. And through that conversation, I think we made a lot of headway that she didn't even realize really what she was protesting, because I frankly would rather the oil and gas come in a pipeline than on the Baltic Sea. That's just my preference. It seems like it's a better environmental friendly way. But I think that conversation can get lost when we just take extreme approaches. So it's good to hear that on the state level, within those state agencies. And I think if you can help us as we develop our relationship together and with our clients, remind them that the state actually isn't out to get you. The state is actually out to support you. So let's start our argument, or not even argument, let's start our proposal, whether we're doing an air permit or whatever permit we're doing, let's start our proposal with that in mind, that we're both on the same team. We're trying to figure out how we can get this production done while satisfying state regulation. And oh, by the way, the federal regulation usually has a place as well.
Yeah.
What is your hope that if you had an opportunity to speak with the CEO of one of your clients, like pick on an oil and gas producer for you, Shar, and you were told you got 30 seconds to tell them why they should embrace this environmental cost that keeps showing up on their P&L that they've never had before, what's your answer to them?
It's going to help you save money by saving product. And if other people care about it, maybe you should care about it too. That was about 30 seconds.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be 30 because oftentimes shorter is better. Erin, when you're out talking to peers and they're like, I don't want to be in oil and gas. I want to be environmental, because environmental has a connotation that if I'm an environmentalist, I'm out picking up plants and studying them and everything else, right? And there's a lot of research out there right now that the reason why oil and gas has a employee problem is because people, they don't want anything to do with it because it's quote unquote bad with the younger generation. How do you respond to people who say that we shouldn't have oil and gas because it's harmful to the environment?
Sure. So,
or mining for that matter, because you have a bit more experience there too, industry in general.
Well, I just feel like, I think when I communicate with others who are in the environmental field, they're big environmental lovers at heart. Like, ultimately, all of us kind of go into it wanting to kind of save the world. And I feel like those are the people that should be there, because they're the ones that take the regulations seriously, and they want to see the gap bridge between the regs and it's seen in practice. I think, they're the ones who actually care about how, what controls are done, what methods are done, what accurate reporting. I feel like if you're someone who actually cares or does care about the environment, being kind of in the front lines, you can see it through. That's always been my background. Is I come from public health. I want to make a difference, in human health and the population health somehow, environmental health somehow. And I found myself here because I feel like I am making a difference overall in environmental health and public health in general by, knowing regulations and helping industries get there.
That's a great answer. I've never thought of it like, hey, wait a second, if you have a problem with it, come on the front lines and help us solve it, right? Yeah. I've always thought like, hey, actually the folks that I meet in the oil and gas industry or the mining or the coal, whatever you pick on, they're the very ones who are using the resources that we're impacting. Like this company is full of hunters and fishermen and everything else. That's like what we do. We're outdoors people. So we have a high motivation to do well with the environment. And if you're having a problem coming into this industry because of an environmental stance, you probably need to do some homework, because you just might not be understanding the role of environmental in industry. It's huge, it's growing, and very importantly, I feel like it's being embraced. And so now you can come have a seat at the table and help that embracement actually turn into reality for folks. So I'm excited to continue to work with you, Erin, and see us do really cool things with our clients. on not just the air quality side and the permitting side, but in other areas we do as well.
Mhm.
And I know Shar, over the last 3 years, I'm a curious person as well. So you've had to give me something as basic as a regulation cheat sheet, which tells us, it's 40 CFR Part 60, subparts, Quad O and Quad O-A, and I've learned all these acronyms that I otherwise would have had no idea, and it's really cool to know that. So keep learning and keep teaching, because it's important that we all embrace this.
Mm.
Thank
Thank
you for coming on. Thanks, Erin.